let's go over essay writing exercise, which I recognize was not the greatest. If we do it again, we'll do it differently. We'll have smaller groups. But like I was saying before class started, I think it really does give you a good idea of what it is I'm looking for in class essay, and just generally in academic writing in general. Like following this is a good recipe for getting an A on things. And I realized I didn't talk about this that much, and so there was some confusion. So I wanted to clarify the difference between like a thesis statement and an introduction. Basically, I should have said thesis statement. Instead of introduction, because introduction could be more. Your thesis statement should be in the introduction. But you know, the thesis statement basically is just the short version of your answer to the question, right? So that's all it is. Ideally, I said it could be one sentence, but it doesn't have to be. It could be 2 or 3, whatever, you know, but as short as possible. It's basically your answer to the question, whatever the essay prompt is. It's your answer to that in the shortest amount of words possible. No explanation, because all that explanation goes in the body paragraphs, right? So save explanation for the body paragraphs. And like I said, you know, you could have some other things in the introduction, but for this class, don't worry about it. You don't have time, you know. Don't tell me what the Cuban Missile Crisis is. Don't go into explaining what the particular event is, because you don't have time. If, you know, especially when we're doing that in-class essay, you just have the class period, right? Just give the only thing that should be in your intro is the thesis, right? So that's pretty straightforward. But first, what you want to do, the first thing you do when you get an essay question prompt, look at that question and make sure that you notice the different parts. Like if often they have different parts, right? So that's really important to notice that there's different parts. There's like 2 or 3 different parts here. In this question, it's asking you to do 3 things. Basically explain, why is this particular thing, this phenomena, a problem for realism? And then how does liberalism explain it, and how does constructivism explain it? So the first thing you want to do is notice that there's different parts to the question and make sure that you're answering all the different parts. The second thing you want to notice is make sure you understand all of the terms that are being used, because if you don't, you can definitely raise your hand and ask for clarification. Like what you just asked about, you know, clarifying about that question about what type of evidence. I want to talk about that. That was a great question of clarification. Because if you think you understand but you're not sure, don't risk it. Just raise your hand and say, what do you mean by balancing, for example? So, and that was a good question. What did we mean by balancing? I just used that, you know, old jargon in there. I didn't think about it, but maybe that term is not super clear. So what did that mean? What does it mean to balance? In this context, what does it mean to balance against other, how did I have it? The other countries did not balance against the US. What does that term mean? I'm gonna try to get more of y'all other quiet people to talk. Amelia, thank you.
Like no other country tried to.
Yeah, kind of, but here's a key thing. Let me, because that's a great way to put it, but there's a key concept here. And that's because if you're thinking that, which some people did, you know, think of like, well, there wasn't one other country that could balance against the US. That's true. But you have multiple countries together, right? It's a classic thing, you know, like the little fish eating the big fish or something like that, right? So in that case, you can think, because it's true that China wasn't powerful enough yet in 1991 to balance against the US, and no other country was either. And a country can't just, you know, immediately go overnight from being, you know, a small country to a big country. So that's not going to happen, right? But what can happen sort of overnight or a relatively short time period is that countries can band together and form alliances with other countries. And then you have instantly, okay, multiple things balancing against the one powerful. So that's what the question was getting at. That's what it meant by balancing, that didn't happen. Not that there wasn't, no other single country chose to balance against the US, but that other countries, like they didn't all get together and form a coalition to fight US hegemony. That was a thing that happened in 1991. So that's just an example of like, asking for clarification in terms and stuff like that when you come to them. So, okay, so you say you've gotten that part, you've looked at the essay prompt and you've thought about the question, you're sure you understand all the terms. And then if you want to write the thesis is the short version of your answer. Well, what's the first thing you do?
Body paragraphs.
Body paragraphs? Yeah, why did I have y'all do that? Why did I have you do the body paragraphs first?
You're just not gonna know, your stance unless you start writing the main chunk of it,
Yeah, because what I want you to do is the opposite of what people do online. When people do online, this is really common, right? I have an opinion on this subject and I'm going to go out and find evidence to support my opinion. That's the online conspiracy type of research, right? Academics is the opposite. You keep an open mind, you don't already know. You might think you have an answer, that's fine. But you look for evidence first and then you form your answer. You don't form your opinion or your answer and then go look for evidence to back yourself up. You see the difference? Totally the opposite of online do your own research thing. So you're looking for evidence. And your evidence is basically the stuff in the text. Right? So anything that's in the text, you can cite as evidence for your answer. So that's why I had y'all do the looking for the evidence first, and y'all did that very well. So that's basically what I want you to go about when you get the in-class essay to think about it. First, discover, are there different parts to the question? Make sure you're answering all the different parts. And then make sure you clarify any key terms that are ambiguous at the time. And then just go and look at your notes, because remember, you won't have the computers. You'll just have your notes. You might have some of the articles printed out. All of that's your evidence. Look at that evidence and say, what can I build out of this evidence? What were some of your answers? Because a lot of you got this part. This was the most intuitive part, the realism. What were some of your answers to, like, why was that a problem? I wanted some other people not always raising their hands. Why was it a problem for realist theory? David?
It's assumed that states will be scared for their own security, or the state becomes too powerful, so they'll need to balance against it.
Right, yeah. So maybe possibly you might have overthought it, that it was something more complicated, but it wasn't. It was just that, realism does assume that wouldn't happen, that will happen, and then it didn't happen. So that's all it was. So yeah, that was all I was looking for there, was just something about how realism argues that a balance of powers is a thing. That whole concept of the balance of power is a real concept. And that's it. You finish that. If you had more detail, like this would be good for a body paragraph, not for the intro. Realists argue that because otherwise, the big powerful state's going to gobble them up. That's the whole reasoning behind it. It's an evening out of power. That part was pretty straightforward. The other two parts were a little bit harder. So how did some of y'all answer this question, this part of the question? How did liberalism explain that? Dustin. No person, not offense to you.
Liberals could point to the strength of the international organizations and alliances formed by these democratic countries as preventing that that need or that push towards balancing against the US.
Yeah, exactly. So international organizations is one. What's the other one? The other reason, other thing that is good, Lars? Oh. Yes, trade, economic interconnectedness. So both of those two things were really strong in 1991. There were lots of international organizations. It wasn't like 1834. Right, there's a difference, you know, like no international, not very many international organizations back in 1830s. But 1990s, there's lots of, you know, we have the UN, we have all the ones that we're familiar with today. All of those were still in existence back in the 90s. So international organizations were numerous, and economic ties and interconnectedness were also a big thing. So that's why liberals would argue both of those things. Basically, what you want to do in that question is just think like, what are the key characteristics? What are the things that liberalism emphasizes? And then just apply that to whatever the situation is. So it doesn't matter what the situation is. You like, if I said like, how does liberalism explain the Cuban Missile Crisis? Essentially the same answer, right? You just think about, well, how do I apply those things that liberalism is always looking at to this current situation? And then how about constructivism? Lars?
The ideologies kind of changed from global to domestic disputes, and also people's ideologies changed, like they were fighting and to focus more on their self-interest.
Yeah, that works. What you said?
And I was just gonna say the shared values, like, so if you have like two people on a global, I guess, council who have the same interests as well, you're liable not to go to war because you got agreement on a higher.
Right. Exactly. But yeah, you know, that whole thing when the Berlin Wall fell and the appeal of the ideals and ideas of the West were very attractive in Eastern Europe at the time. So that's exactly shared ideas and norms that those ideas had changed. And so that's why countries didn't see, like, constructivism is all about who is seen. Remember, the other thing about shared ideas, the other thing about constructivism is identities, how we see ourselves and how we see others. That influences who we see as a threat. Right? So constructivist answer is just that other countries didn't see the US as a threat. It's all about perception. Okay, so we had this thing, you know, different types of realists. One of them that we hadn't talked about yet that was brought up in the Poast article was this neoclassical realism. That came about only about 20 years ago. And basically what neoclassical realism is, it's the influence of the role of domestic influences at the same time as the structural.
System sometimes.
That's great. I like that one. Because infrastructure, physical infrastructure, we know what that is, right? Like bridges and roads and, you know, the things that make society work physically. So if we're talking about the social world, think about that infrastructure as ideas. So instead of a physical bridge or a physical road or railway or something, we have ideas that structure society. The other example I was thinking of with structural is structural racism. We encounter that phrase a lot, right? And so what does that mean? What does structural racism mean, Anthony?
Like, way I understand it, it's like racism and like the government through like employment discrimination, or like, how housing discrimination, like redlining.
Right, so what is it not? What is structural racism not? How do you, Alec, yeah.
Racism on an individual level.
Yeah,
Exactly, that's it. So think about it that way, because that will tell you, that will give you an idea of what structure means. Individual racism, or what we say, like bias, personal bias or prejudice, that's one thing. But structural racism is built into the structures of society, like our laws, the way we, like redlining, the way houses, yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was saying like our policies and
Policies.
that kind of.
Yes. Yeah, there are things that it's harder to get at because they're kind of built into the way we do everyday life. Right? There's like these little things that structure our everyday life in society. So that's what structure means. And so the same thing with international structure. When they're talking about structural realism, they mean the structure of nation states. How nation states are positioned in relation to other nation states, which basically just boils down to power. Who's got the most power? Certain kind of power, usually. Military power and economic power. Constructivists say, though, actually, there's also ideological power, the power of ideas. But usually, like military power, economic power. We have this week an example of structural realism applied, right? Thinking about the Graham Allison article. What's Graham Allison's basic argument in the article? There's some people I haven't talked to. So I'm never going to learn anybody else's names. What was Graham Allison's basic argument?
It needed to defend the status quo,
Yeah,
whereas the rising power wanted to change that.
exactly. Yeah. So that same dynamic that was happening back with Sparta and Athens, there's this famous one-liner that the cause of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides says this in like the very first paragraph, was the rise of Athens and the fear in which this, this incited in Sparta. Yeah, the fear that this incited in Sparta. So it's nothing about Athens, the particular characteristics of it. It's just about that power dynamic of the state. So that's the structure of the system. Does that make sense? The structure of the system is you have one thing on top and this other thing is getting more powerful. It's threatening that one thing. And that structure, that particular dynamic, that particular power dynamic is what causes the war. It's what causes the conflict, both back in, the Sparta and Athens, and then Graham Allison is saying now with the US and China. That's the Thucydides trap. So it has nothing, it doesn't matter who's the leader of these countries. He's saying all that matters is that power dynamic. I got off on a tangent because I was explaining neoclassical realism. Okay, so neoclassical realism, they take that. They say, okay, yeah, well, I'll grant you that. That's a given. We'll go with that. But just because that may be happening, any individual leader can't just respond to that. They can't just do whatever, because there's domestic influences that influence how much they can do. So, for example, after World War II, Europe was devastated. The US wanted to provide a lot of economic aid to various countries in Europe. I think Greece was one, I think Turkey was the other. But the feeling back home was that the war is over. We should have a peace dividend now. We should spend that money on education and healthcare and all those things, right? That sounds good, yes? So that was the sentiment. Also, people thought taxes should go down. Taxes had been high during the war, to fight the war. So shouldn't taxes go down again? Yeah, people, that's the sentiment back domestically, right? So you have this domestic pressure, the political climate at home, which limits that country's response to the structural reality abroad. The structure, you may need to do something because of the international structure, but if the political sentiment back home is not in that direction, then you're constrained by that. So neoclassical realism combines structural realism with not exactly first level, like somebody said, I think, but more like domestic politics. So it's just a good example of how none of these things are exclusive. Here you have even a systems level analysis, a structural realist. Graham Allison is definitely, he would call himself a structural realist. Even in their theory, they're still going to say, okay, well, some individual leaders that matters somewhat. So it's a matter of emphasis. They say this matters more. The structure matters more. And then I wanted to introduce this term here, normative theory, which you probably haven't heard of before, but we're going to talk about it more especially when we get to week 9, critical theories. Normative theory. So realism, like Dennis is pointing out, realism is an amoral theory. What's the difference between amoral and immoral? Y'all remember that, Dustin?
Amoral would be not focusing on the morality of a given thing. Immoral would be doing something that is not moral.
Right, yeah. So amoral just means it's neutral. It doesn't see morality as relevant. So some people could say that's immoral. That would be a legitimate argument against that. That's what the critical theories argue, is that when something purports to be amoral, it's really not. It really has moral implications. It's just that they're not acknowledging them, which is worse. So that's definitely a line of argument that some take. So we call it normative theory. Normative theory is any theory that refuses to pretend that morality doesn't have a place in politics. Because both realism and liberalism, maybe more so realism, but somewhat liberalism, both of these don't directly talk about morality. They don't, when they say a state should do something, they don't mean they should do it because it's right. They mean they should do it like a realist. If a realist says a state should do something, they mean the state should do it in order to survive. That's what they mean, not because it's the right thing to do. But think about Machiavelli advising the prince. If you want to continue to have your principality, you need to do X, Y, and Z. He doesn't say, like many of the other, what makes him different is that previous advice books for princes at the time would give advice to princes based on Christianity. So Machiavelli explicitly rejects that. Christianity would say you should do X, Y, and Z based on the morals of Christianity as they were understood at the time. Machiavelli says no. You should do X, Y, and Z because you otherwise won't have a state anymore and then you won't be prince. Morality has nothing to do with it, he says. So that's the weirdness, I guess you could say. The interestingness, whatever you want to call it, like, is this good or bad? It's up to you to decide, but that's what realism does, is it sets aside any notion of what should, well, I shouldn't say it like that because they do say what should happen, but they set aside any notions of morality. They purport to be totally an amoral theory. So that's that normative theory.
Exactly what I said.
There it is.
Okay, yeah, so I got a little confused when I was reading, the Graham Allison article, because I was wondering kind of the lines get a bit blurry for me when I'm looking at like realism and, liberalism and how, like, we want to spread democracy, we want to protect those ideas, but at what point is that just our self-interest that we're trying to protect? So doesn't that kind of play into realism a little bit? Like, yeah, this is like, this is what we're protecting and we'll protect it at all costs, and we want to spread it for those reasons, and it's an idea. But then I kind of pushed me kind of towards liberalism. It's like, well, the whole point is spreading democratic ideals and liberalism and having international organizations and cooperation. So yeah, kind of
So
understand.
if the question is, do these map, do realism and liberalism map onto familiar ideologies, like conservative versus progressive? If that's the question, I'd say no, they don't map precisely. Mostly because remember whenever I showed you all the differences between the two types of liberalism, mostly because of that. But the other question is, are these things ideologies? Is realism and liberalism, or are realism and liberalism ideologies in and of themselves? Like setting aside the more familiar ideologies, but can we think of them as ideologies? But then I was like, oh, not. I remember I told y'all about like reading about populism, and there's a famous definition of populism that people have been trying to define it for decades. And a famous definition of populism is that it's a thin ideology. Sometimes they use this in poli-sci, thin versus thick. Thin meaning it's barely there. Thick meaning there's lots of it there. So he says populism is a thin ideology, meaning it's barely an ideology. Why is it barely an ideology? Because it doesn't have that much other than throw the bums out. There is to it. Versus a thick ideology is like communism. There's lots of stuff, like there's lots of, it's built on, it's thick. There's a lot of stuff that goes into it to make something communist. To make something populist, all you need to have is like, that's what he meant about thin versus thick ideology. But ideology, I was like, well, let me look up a definition. There we go, basic definition of ideology from. The American Heritage Dictionary. One thing that we would, it's probably what we have in our heads. It's a set of doctrines or beliefs that are shared by members of a social group and form the basis of a political, economic, or other system. So communism is an ideology, capitalism is an ideology, so economic systems. Yeah. What do you think about that definition?
So basically, is it saying that an ideology has to be formed within, like, say, a political or structured group compared to, say, someone coming up with an idea and then it's spreading among others, kind of spread out and not really kind of official? Like, would that not be considered an ideology?
Wouldn't it?
Yeah,
What do y'all think?
because I mean, that's how Marxism spread, right?
It's just it sounds like it's any collectively held group of ideas
Right.
that have some basis. And that this guy adds, leads specifically to political action. That's
That idea of like specifically political action, if we're looking at like the theories as like policy setting, like as to inform policy, then it's easy to see them as ideology because they are political action.
yeah, which leads to that whole great discussion about Post's point about realism as description versus realism as prescription. And I loved reading your comments about that because that was super interesting. And I don't know, did we come to a conclusion? Did anybody feel like you came to a conclusion about it? I tried to write down all these notes so I could call on people. Don't call on me. Yeah, what do you think? Just generally, does realism work better? Jaden, what do you think? Does realism work better as just to describe, or does it make sense to say if it's gonna describe something, doesn't that imply it's gonna prescribe a course of action?
Well, I think the thing with that is that you can describe something like the same way, but also take away different things from it. And then like you can look like, I think the way to put it is you can look at it the same way, but then you can have 1,000,001 solutions to that same problem. And so I think that's really where it sort of gets like airy when it comes to like realism as prescription, because you have the basis, but then you have so many different avenues of approach, and it's never going to be the same result every time.
Yeah.
There's always going to be that at play.
Alex, what do you think?
I think that you can't really know a situation until after it happened, and to prescribe a certain thing like realism is a very dangerous path to take, because then it potentially, and I'm not saying everyone thinks like this, but it potentially can lead to people saying, well, there's going to be something bad happen anyways, so.
Yes, that word dangerous, and I had Connor's point, and similar to, was it Hayden's point? No, Christopher's point. That I think y'all said something like, where was it? Somebody said something like it's because of the lack of communication leads to a bunch of unknowns, and if you don't know, and if you're a pessimist and you're a realist, you assume the worst. Right? And then Connor, you were saying like the chicken and egg thing. For some reason, your comment reminded me of Christopher's. But yeah, it's just this idea, like if you don't know and you are a realist, you assume the worst, then does this lead to like the worst possible outcome, which like war? So yeah, I thought that was a really great.
Like the description versus prescription, you can use the description as like a way to anticipate using realism to anticipate states' actions. Like the war in Ukraine, that can be predicted then because there was a growing power. But it's not necessarily.
Wouldn't necessarily tell you what to do. We use realism that way. Is that the question? To just see, just predict what's going to happen, but not necessarily to guide what your response should be. Is that what you mean?
I guess, but like, how does like realist theory? I guess I understand that it acts in state interest. It's very like cynical, but does it also account for like international reaction, like sanctions and things? Like, because like if a state like does something bad, like invading another state, but it does so out of a realist justification, then how does kind of
are the other states going to understand? Whoa, well, we totally understand why you did that. It's fine.
like you
Right,
know,
yeah.
like a state doesn't invade another state, and everybody else is just like that's fine.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. That's what liberals and constructivists would say. That's a problem. And, and here's the strongest criticism. Y'all don't pack up yet. We still have 5 minutes. The strongest criticism of Graham Allison's argument here was captured in that quote by Xi Jinping in the article, who said, there is no such thing as the Thucydides trap, but if you keep talking about it, you'll make it happen. So that was my final point here. I got through all of them. Reification, there's a big SAT word, or GRE word, since we're done with SATs now at this point. Right? What does it mean to reify something? Connor, what do you think?
Put complex thought into words, basically.
Yeah, and that does what? That does what? To reify something, I was going to tell you, it means to make it real. If you talk about something like it's a real thing, because especially we're talking about the social world here, when you talk about something as if it's real, you can make it real. Actualizing it, that's a great way to put it. Yes. Yeah. So that's not a thing in the natural sciences. I can talk about a new mineral, and no matter how much I talk about it, it's not going to materialize, right? But in the social world, that can totally happen. So that's, I think, one of the strongest criticisms about realism. And many people wrote responses to Graham Allison, you know, just along those lines that, yeah, if you think that way, then you're gonna make that happen. You're gonna bring that situation into being. So it goes back to, you know, what, you know, we're talking about like the unknown. And since it's unknown, if you assume the worst, you're gonna make the bad situation happen because you're expecting it to happen. So, yeah, it's like the power of positive thinking maybe is, what do you think, Connor?
Yeah, I gotta be honest. I think that naming it realism is a little bit pretentious. Like, this is-
Good point. Yeah, yeah, you said something about like, is it really realistic or something? Yeah. It does kind of give it's very, yeah, because it's making a claim to say, to pretend like it's the most accurate description.
Yeah, it's like we're gonna put our emotions aside, no,
Yeah.
optimism, like, this is just the cold hard facts, one of like really the case.
Yeah, because there's lots of room for interpretation and other, that's what we'll see next week. With liberalism and stuff. You gotta have the last word because I wanted to get more of y'all who have not talked.
I had a question going off of what someone said earlier. It's like the idea that amoral behavior, realism like encourages, how that could potentially spur like sanctions from other countries. Would a neoclassical realist take that into account on how international relations affects like domestic like life, and it limits what they can do, right?
Or the reverse, how does domestic life affect international relations or foreign policy?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
that would be neoclassical.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, we have like 2 minutes.
Try to make it.
Okay.
I think one thing that I've been thinking about is that I don't think realism, at least from what I could see, takes morality out of the equation. Because at the end of the day, if you're, even though if like another country invades another country, there's still going to be backlash, and the country will still have to think about, okay, how am I going to have to deal with this if it
Yeah.
isn't, if the invasion isn't going to be seen in a moral light?
That's a good point. So, yeah, so
It still does have a play, I think.
this idea that, you know, foreign policy should be completely amoral, like morality doesn't come into it, but then maybe it does, maybe it's not really amoral. Yeah, there's no answers to these. This is up to you to decide, you know, but these are the questions that we keep talking about in international relations. So next week we go on to liberalism. There's not that much reading. There's just some things in the modules about international organizations.